Well, I skied today. Usually limit myself to 6 runs, and knowing it was the last day of the season for me, I made 7. Came home pretty tired and cross. I guess I'm even more cross when I get back to this particular topic, torture. Just getting around to it. From the USA Today, Wednesday, February the 27th, 2008, on the page that they titled The Forum, and it's written by Jonathan Turley, the Shapiro Professor of Public Interest Law at George Washington University, who is a member of USA Today's Board of Contributors. Cleverly, I guess, trying to get people to at least read and think a little bit, the author calls it a tortured defense. And he says, or the editor and the headline writers say, as a prelude to getting into what Mr. Turley actually wrote, the guessing game is over. We know the U.S. government okayed and utilized waterboarding. So what, if anything, are we going to do about it? I'm telling you, if we're people of conscience, if we're people of good faith, if we're Christians, if we're just decent human beings that value the standing of our country in the world, we ought to be insisting that something be done about it. But let me go on with what Mr. Turley did. He starts out by saying that consumers, it's clever, are often faced with difficult choices between product styles in today's diverse markets. There is Chicago versus New York style pizza, Memphis versus Texas style barbecue. Coming out of Kansas, I want to think it would be Kansas City style versus Texas. Swedish versus Japanese style massage. And then, knowing how that thing is on the market, he says it's not surprising, therefore, that when the Bush administration decided to get into the torture business, it had to shop around. Imagine our country's leaders shopping around for the best way to torture people. Something that's a crime to do in our country. He goes on to say, testimony given this month by Stephen Bradbury, the acting chief of the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel. And he says that man is one of the chief characters in the controversy about torture. While it received relatively little attention, Bradbury not only acknowledged the formal program of waterboarding, he also casually distinguished between President Bush's approach from the historical models, such as those used by the Spanish Inquisition. Now, I'm quoting him again, though Bradbury insisted that the only thing in common is, I think, quoting him, the use of water, Mr. Turley says he omitted the other common denominator, and that's pain. Fear, pain. It appears that the administration rejected water ingestion rather than water saturation to cause the pain. It turns out that the administration thought seriously about its own style of waterboarding but opted for the Khmer Rouge style over the Spanish style. Mr. Turley goes on to say that for civil libertarians, it was like having the Inquisition's Tomas de Torquemada calmly testifying on 10 charming facts about torture. So here we are, he says, yet while members of Congress are falling over themselves this month to demand criminal charges in the scandal over performance-enhancing drugs in baseball, there's a conspicuous silence in the wake of Bradbury's tour de force about torture. For months, both parties hid behind the rationalization. If you don't admit it, well, anyway, hid behind the administration's. For months, both parties hid behind the rationalization that the torture program remained a mere allegation to avoid the looming criminal question. Indeed, Attorney General Michael Murkowski refused to recognize that waterboarding has been declared as torture by both domestic and international courts, noting that it would be speculative. The company we keep. I'm skipping. Even our closest allies, such as Britain, have stated the obvious. The United States is now an official member of torture-practicing nations. God help us. He didn't say that, I did. We share this distinction, back to him, with such kindred spirits as North Korea, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Burma. Now here he gets at the point as to why probably nothing's really going to be done about it. It has been disclosed that both Democratic and Republican members of Congress have known for years about the torture program. So they keep quiet because they also are incriminated. Yes, Bush, I think, is the main person responsible, but these guys knew and didn't do anything. Current and former officials have confirmed the use of waterboarding. One of CIA's interrogators, John Kiriakou, publicly discussed the use of waterboarding on detainees and agreed that it was torture. The author goes on to say, the question now is, how do you ignore a torture program that's hiding in plain view? He says, after all, Bradbury did everything short of cheerfully demonstrating the technique on a detainee for the education and amusement of the House members. Skipping a little. Oh, one thing I do want to pick up is he said that some of the methods were not used because even though it's a form of waterboarding, the victims of the waterboarding had a nasty habit. They often died. I think our president did want to try to use a method that gets the results but doesn't have those fatalities to haunt him. As Bradbury's testimony and various reports indicate, reading again, the Bush administration opted for the standard variation of the tortura del agua, of putting a cloth or a piece of plastic over the face of the victim while pouring water over his face. It achieves the same sensation of drowning and the inability to breathe. If you've ever been where you couldn't breathe, you can well imagine that's torture. This technique was used by governments such as Cambodia's Khmer Rouge under Pol Pot. To think we'd sink to that level. Well, I can tell you one guy that came out early against the torture program, John McCain. I'm sure he saw some torture as a prisoner of war. By golly, I'll bet you if John McCain becomes president of the United States that torture program will stop within days of his inauguration. And he's one tough cookie on that war thing. I'm not with him on continuing the war over there in Iraq. But by golly, he'd put a stop to the torture and help get us off of a list of idiot, horrible countries that use torture and who are so unsophisticated as not to face up to the fact that you can use torture and break almost any human being and get whatever answer you want. Shame on us. Shame on us. You get the answer you want. It isn't necessarily the truth. We've sunk to a deplorable level of national leadership when our president initiated a torture